Morning, colleagues, and welcome to the next episode of DINCast, where I'm going to be talking with Cris Beswick, advisor, speaker, author. His latest publication was Building a Culture of Innovation, which, as you know, is a topic close to our heart about how you actually go about doing that. And I'm going to be talking with Cris today about all things innovation, but particularly about why so much innovation fails and what you as leaders can actually sort of do about that. So, Cris, good morning, sir.
Morning, how are you?
I'm very well. It's great to have you taking part in this episode of DINCast. For those people who don't know you, could you sort of just give us a brief introduction to your self and your innovation journey?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose the journey's been, 20 or so years. The first sort of chunk of that was spent in the design industry. So I'm originally actually an industrial designer. And I built a group of companies in that space. So hence my leadership hat as a CEO. And then the last 10 years, I came out of those businesses just before Lehman Brothers crashed, actually. And since then, I've worked as an advisor in the corporate space, helping CEOs and senior leaders understand this often misunderstood word, innovation. So yeah, and as you say, I've wrote a couple of books on the subject and speak all over the world, things like that.
So in terms of sort of defining down what is innovation, what is innovation to you then, Cris? How would you define it?
This is an interesting one, right? Because I think one of the challenges with innovation is the word itself has been devalued over the last decade, certainly. And the word's been bastardized as well over the last decade. It's been used so much and used out of context. And now, most people in organizations don't really know exactly what it means. It's easy to say, well, innovation is, the introduction of something new that adds value or something like that. That's the typical definition. But I think all of those types of definitions don't really help us understand what innovation is. So just to give people that are listening a really quick insight, I think in how I describe innovation is this, or how I help senior leaders describe it. This is the framework, and they then have to decide, create a definition on their own. I think the first thing about innovation is you have to separate it from invention. So yes, it has to be about the introduction of something new or different, but that doesn't mean that it has to be about the introduction of something that has never existed before. This isn't putting a new element on the periodic table. So new and different doesn't necessarily mean it never existed before. The second thing is it has to solve a problem. The third thing is, for me, it has to then add value over and above just solving the problem. And the fourth part of the definition is then it has to derive or create some kind of return for the creator. So when we put all that together, I describe innovation for me as the introduction of something new or different that solves a genuine customer problem, that also adds real value on top of the solution and delivers a return for the creator. So that's sort of roughly how I like to think about innovation.
No, that's a brilliant description of it there, Cris. So you now spend a lot of your time, as you say, supporting blue chip companies, large scale businesses, leaders of all sort of descriptions, build a culture of innovation.
Yeah.
And again, I'm fascinated as to why it's so hard, or it seems so hard, to build a culture of innovation. What's your experiences of the organizations and leaders that you've worked with around achieving that?
So the first thing is, it's not hard to build a culture of innovation. It's hard work, but it's not difficult and it's not insurmountable. The challenge with most corporates is building that kind of culture takes time, and you have to do it by building a system, a system or a systematic approach to innovation. And the challenge with that is that system is always going to be at odds with the current system that the organization operates in. So when you combine, the need to completely redesign the organization's system to build that kind of culture When you combine that with, this is a very much a long-term view, which is also then at odds with, but we need to deliver results for the next quarter, i.e. a short-term view, which most corporates have, you just get this real polarized challenge where it's a redesign of the organization and it takes time. And over here, you've got senior leaders saying, well, we haven't got time to do that, and we need to hit some numbers by the end of the quarter. So there's always this tension between those two approaches.
And how do you help leaders sort of get over that? Because presumably you're going to have to be very brave to go against some of these short-term objectives that you measured and potentially rewarded on. So how do you persuade organizations it's worth this long-term investment?
Well, the simplest way is just getting them to look outside the window, right? Metaphorically, if you think you as an organization, so if I'm talking to a leadership team now, the narrative is, if you think that your organization is so great at what it does that it's impervious to everything else in the world that all other organizations are facing, then we don't need to do anything. If you think your Kodak moment will never happen, if you think that, COVID-19, for example, isn't going to affect your business whatsoever, i.e. you're not going to fail, turnover's not going to reduce, you're not going to lose customers, new startups aren't going to take big chunks of market share off you. If you think you're impervious to all that, then yeah, there's no need to look at innovation and there's no need to change or redesign that system. You just have, the challenge is you have to have what I call inconvenient conversations. And it's about saying, we might hit that next quarter and we might hit those numbers, but what about the next quarter after that? And then the next 6 months, and then the year after that, and the next few years. We have to take long-term views. So they're difficult conversations, but it's just about getting senior leaders to reframe their view on how sustainable their organization is.
So you mentioned there about failure, and I wonder if we can sort of explore that, because failure is a key component of learning, and presumably if you're innovating and you're experimenting, you're going to have a lot of failures before you sort of get there. With organizations which are set up to avoid failure, their KPIs, their measures are all about driving out failure. How would you sort of, have that conversation with leaders to help them understand that actually failure should be part of their culture?
Yeah. So the challenge is that very system, right? That very system itself that almost all organizations are built upon, which is now, the start of the Industrial Revolution. Go back to the first sort of production lines, Henry Ford, we built management structures and systems around, we now must have 10 cars off the production line, not 5. So it's about efficiency and we can't make mistakes. And, every wheel needs to be bolted on within 2 minutes, etc. And then, so we then had supervisors and then team leaders and then managers and then leaders. That whole architecture is over 100 years old now and just isn't fit for purpose, right? The way that we manage and lead organizations historically doesn't work today. So you have to completely rebuild that system. You have to look at that system in a different way. And, look at how venture capitalists look at their work. They understand that they will invest in, let's say, 10 businesses and 6, 7, 8 of them will fail, right? Or they not necessarily fail, but won't pay off. The 2 that do will far outweigh the ones that fail. We have to have different approaches to how we lead. And the challenge is about being smart about risk, not being cavalier about it.
And part of the discussions I have within the social housing space is organizations who want to be innovative, want to be creative, see the value in that, but struggle with actually putting their hard cash in there, i.e. investing in that. And I think, is there a risk that those organizations, the ones who've massively invested in this, the likes of, the Amazons, Microsofts and Googles, they're just going to continue to accelerate away. And those organizations who choose not to put the money where the mouth is, their experiences to their customers are the gap's just going to grow in terms of how people experience service.
Yeah. I think so. The challenge is we have to move with those people, right? Organizations have to move with those customers. Organizations have to move with society, with how people, whether they're tenants or whether they're consumers of brands like Amazon or Apple, all of those businesses have to be built around the central tenant, which is those people and those customers. And innovation's about maintaining relevance and maintaining alignment with those customers. So it's almost, innovation now is the price of entry. It wasn't before. Innovation was that competitive advantage. A certain level of innovation and constant evolution is now the price of entry.
So one of the things when you're sort of setting up a program for organizations and leaders is they're going to want to know how their innovation journey is developing. Is it on track? Is it starting to sort of pay back? I mean, how do you measure innovation success or failure?
When what you're now talking about is we refer to it as innovation accounting. So how we account for and measure multiple components along that journey. And there's two things. One of the things that organizations typically miss is the people side. So they'll track metrics like how many ideas have we had, how many new products have we created, how much revenue have we derived from, the new widget that we created. And all of those, listen to the language that I just used there. All of those metrics are from that old system. It's sales, growth, products, volume. So we still have to measure things like that because those are the outputs of those innovation efforts are what we want. But we also have softer metrics like, a perfect example is if we sat the global head of growth at, ABC Limited, right? The global head of growth, we sat him down and we said, if we build a culture of innovation, what does that mean to you? And he or she's going to say, well, it means new products. It means I can sell more. It means I hit targets. It means we grow. It means, that curve starts to go this way, all of the positive things. If we then sat the global head of HR down and said, what does it mean to you? The global head of HR is going to go, do you know what? If we can build a demonstrable, evident culture of innovation, that's going to help me retain talent. It's going to help me recruit the best and brightest people in the world. It's going to increase employee engagement and satisfaction, etc. So we have to measure lots and lots of different things that all contribute to that system. What organizations typically do is they only measure the things that they think are of value, i.e. the things that the old system would have measured.
Really good point there, Chris. And I just wondered for my sort of viewers in the social housing space, what do you think, we can learn from other sectors about their approach to innovation?
I think the main thing for me is innovation fundamentally is about, for me, it's about the pursuit of better, right? And purpose, as another example, is about the pursuit of better. So, looking at innovation as a vehicle to continuously do things better for the people that we're there to serve. Yeah. So really focusing on, why do we exist? What's the raison d'etre of this organization, whether you're in housing or anything else? And innovation is the vehicle to constantly deliver better for those people, i.e. constantly to deliver against that raison d'etre. And regardless of what industry you're in, regardless of what thing you do, fundamentally, this is about people. And that means it's human-centric, i.e. and human-centered is a big thing that everyone's talking about now. But they're talking about it because that's right. It's right. It is what we should focus on. Regardless of what industry you're in, if you boil everything down and start with that empathy-driven, human-centered approach, then that will guide the path and the innovation things that you look at. And we need to be much more human-centered. You talked earlier about, you mentioned about innovating and risk and, would we want to risk tenants' money, for example, if we tried something and it failed? Well, I think most organizations would be surprised that, tenants aren't like any customer, right? They're not necessarily going to be really cheesed off if they think, well, why did that company waste £1,000 of our money? That's that money that they get from our rent, etc. Why have they wasted that? Well, if the pursuit and the reason for spending that money is about solving something and making something better, right? People understand that. What we don't do in organizations is communicate why we're doing these things. And also, we don't co-create solutions with them. If you bring tenants in, if you bring customers in and start to design solutions with them, and I mean properly with them, not design it in isolation and then ask them what they think, right? I mean, properly co-create solutions with them. All the conversations around, well, that idea didn't work, how much does that cost us? They, in every instance where I've seen it, they just dissipate because people understand that it's not a waste of money. Actually, we've now learned what doesn't work, and that helps us evolve and shift the focus on what we know is going to work.
So you spend a lot of your time, as I say, horizon scanning, looking at other sectors, what's actually happening out there. And you've mentioned about COVID and actually that being almost an accelerator for organizations to invest in innovation. So where do you see the next areas of disruption and innovation coming from? And what sort of form do you think it'll take?
I think one of the sectors that's really interesting is transport, or the auto sector. So, this was pre-COVID, really. Governments have been giving the transport and the automotive industry, targets around zero emissions and being carbon neutral for quite a while now. But COVID has massively accelerated that because most of the car makers just haven't sold any cars this year. So it's really accelerated that shift. So you've had these two dynamics. You've had governments saying we need you to be we can't produce gas guzzling V8 cars anymore, emissions, etc. And now COVID has really shone a light on those organizations. There must be fields like all over the world, just of thousands and thousands of cars just sat there, and they're probably never going to be sold, right? So I think one of the really interesting things that will unfold is how rapidly the automotive industry shifts to electric vehicles. You've got Bentley. I saw a thing from Bentley this morning announcing that literally within the next 4 or 5 years, they're just going to completely shift their range to electric. So that whole dynamic now around performance, luxury, all of the things that we buy into and that we associate with supercars and things like that, how they recreate that now, I think it's going to be really interesting. And then one of the other sectors that I'm really interested in is like the humanitarian side industries. So things like World Economic Forum, some of the things that they're doing around trying to drive innovation and solve really systemic global problems. UNICEF's another great example. Anyone in any sector, just go and look at what UNICEF are doing and look at their innovation strategy. You can get it online, you can download it. It's really interesting. That's a perfect example of what I spoke about earlier. Purpose-driven, human-centered. How do we change the world? How do we stop people dying? And they've managed to drive innovation. They've got something like over 12,000 employees. They're in nearly 200 countries around the world. There's some really interesting things to learn from organizations which aren't the Netflixes and the Amazons and the Apples. And, everyone always cites them, but I think some of the more really interesting organizations are ones that no one talks about.
So you've given us lots of sort of insights there about innovation, sort of the pursuit of better. It's the price of entry now. If you were to sort of leave viewers with one sort of final thought that they should be thinking about or take on board, what would that be for them?
If it's leaders, right, let's split this down into a couple of things. If we're talking to leaders now, leaders of organizations, figure out what one of the frameworks that I use is something called, and the name of it doesn't matter, but it's called ODC, own, drive, and collaborate, right? And the ownership bit is purely around leaders. If innovation's really important to your organization and you're genuinely serious about it, get together with your senior team, right? And don't just do this over an hour in a meet, in the typical boardroom. Spend a lot of time and figure out what owning innovation really, really means. As a leadership team, if we genuinely own the innovation agenda, what does that mean? And how will that then enable our organization? But I mean, really own it, like really unpack that. And then for anyone else, if you're interested in innovation, I think if there's one thing you can do if you're interested in trying to pursue better, it goes back to that human-centered approach, right? Figure out and really work on being truly empathy-driven, right? Try and understand things, whether it's customers, whether it's tenants, whether it's potential customers. Look at the world from their perspective, and the insight and the intelligence that you gain from that, if you do it properly, is where your innovation journey should start. When you really understand people and their context, that's when you find the problems that really need to be solved. The better we get at that as organizations, the better innovators will be.
Well, Cris, look, thank you so much, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I think there's so many things to sort of take away for anybody watching or listening to this. And I do hope that it's at some point in the future, perhaps next year, we can get you involved and meet some of the social housing leaders and share some of your frameworks and experiences in more detail. So thank you very much.
No worries. That'd be my pleasure.